Thanks to the Center for Fiction, and thanks for Rick for going along with this. I'm just so psyched to be up here reading these. I'm going to read two very short stories. The first one is called State Forests. I saw him standing on the Ward's Island Bridge and had to resist the urge to just stop and watch. I thought he might jump, so I climbed the ladder to the crosswalk and started walking toward him. It felt impulsive and slow at the same time. Maybe it was just the heat that day, like there was a suddenness, but it was all on a 7-second delay. I was sweating by the time I came near. I shouted something, some sort of nonsense. It could have been anything. The air felt thinner above the river. The water below roared in ways you never hear from the ground. The sound of traffic carried with the water, as if the traffic and the river were both shouting up, as if when you listened and tried to untwine all the strands of sound, you could hear jump coming from below. Or maybe I said jump, even as I meant to say don't jump. Maybe don't had gotten tangled up in the city sounds, I don't know. I had wanted to discourage him to say something about being alive still, at least in the beginning. But then he was laughing. He'd heard the river too, or was he laughing at me? I thought you were going to jump, I said. I was close enough to grab him if I had wanted. I'm just taking in the view. His voice sounded exactly like mine. It had the same timbre, the same inflection. The water below seemed fraught with itself, breathless. It's quite a view, I admitted. Did he say anything? We were watching a helicopter above Williamsburg now. It wasn't any bigger than a fly. It approached, dangling over the water, steady, bigger now, like a dragonfly, then rearing overhead like a dragon. Then away and off like a dragonfly again, then north. Over Queens it was just a fly again. And then it was just a fleck of ash. Traffic had stopped. People were getting out of the cars and shouting, "Don't jump," or something. The way the sound rose, you could hear jump. You could feel all the desire gathering up with the roar of the river, chaotic and musical. I drove a taxi all through grad school, he said. I always hated that parkway. Sometimes I drive around all day, I said. I'll just take a rental out upstate, drive around like I'm still married, like we're looking for a place to spend a few hours. Those were the days. A nice forest preserve, someplace like that, I said. We jumped. Or at least we were no longer standing on the bridge. The fall seemed to never end. We were in a free fall. It felt perpetual, binding. The wind roared like it had jumped along with us. We were married there, you know, my wife and I. There? He asked. I pointed. Carl Schurz Park, over the underpass where all the traffic has stopped. It was a lovely wedding, I said. Oh, I don't doubt it, he said. It's where the mayor lives, after all. I wonder, will the water be cold, I said. I suppose I was just trying to keep conversation up, trying to keep our minds occupied. I never married, he said. I think I would have had an Episcopalian service. Big church, doleful bells. He seemed lost in thought. For how long we felt, I don't know. I put on weight, and my hair thinned and grayed. We lost interest in each other's conversation. We flew into little silent rages and moments of extraordinary gratefulness. It was hard to talk over the roar of the approaching water, but you know, you get used to shouting. You forget the water. You just keep falling and falling. I woke 1,000 times. I dreamed about driving for miles and miles, looking for state forests, places to stop, places with names: Loyalsock, Susquehannock, Hogsback. Would the river smash us like stone? Or would our hearts burst instead before we hit the surface? He was singing, "Wild geese that fly with the moon on their wing." Never had kids, I shouted. I saw my wife somewhere waiting up. I saw her writing down names. Now the harder edges of the city had turned to dust. Its yellow ghosts hung shapeless in the ozone. The skyline looked like a diorama some neighbor kid had smashed up, like you come home from work and there's this strange kid sitting in your living room and there's a skyline all over the floor. I thought about an old joke I still found funny. Jokes still made me laugh. Then I realized that I had misunderstood what had been funny about it. It had taken all these years, all along the thing had just flown over my head. And still, even now, I found myself laughing. I had an unrelated thought. I closed my eyes and it was gone. This next story is called, I didn't put titles on these and I'm forgetting a little bit. The Good Life. Once in San Diego, I was picked up at the airport by a woman I used to know in high school. She hadn't actually come for me, but had just flown in herself and recognized me standing at the baggage claim. "I thought it was you," she said. I had never known her well. We'd kept with different circles, and so the enthusiasm of her embrace seemed misplaced. I recalled that her first name was almost the same as her last name. She offered to drive me to my hotel, then suggested dinner first as we located her expensive car in the lot. She said she was in sales and was returning from a trip to Canada. She appeared to have done well. She drove too fast, and when her car took turns, the wheels sounded in a fine-tuned German shriek. It was like old times without really having had any. As she spoke, her thoughts seemed to arrive, light, and pass me in clusters of knotted logic, operating on some set of predetermined rules I hadn't learned, but liked the sound of anyway. "You've lost weight," she said. "Imagine you and me escaping that shithole." At dinner, she ordered glass after glass of wine and somehow stayed sober, recalled things that happened to me that had never occurred, people we both knew well that I hadn't known at all. It eventually dawned on me that she had mistaken me for someone else. "Congratulations," she said, toasting. Later in the car, she turned off the air conditioning, took out a plastic bag filled with white powder and held it out like a dead offering. "Pharmaceutical grade," she said. "We take the money up to Vancouver," she said. "The old rinse and spin, cut it up like wedding cake," she said. I saw a man standing in the parking lot and recalled the name of a boy in high school who looked like me. We were seldom confused with each other, but then again, years had passed. "My husband broke my back in 2 places," she said. The man in the parking lot walked toward us, passed, and disappeared inside the door of another car. "Did you worry?" she said. She had stopped looking at me as she spoke. I no longer understood who she was talking to. "You know you've achieved peace when," she started to say. I could see where her nose had probably been broken, a small crest at the bridge the dark had brought out. As if she realized I had noticed this, she lifted her face from the plastic bag and said, "You get to where all you see are the spaces between people on the street." Thank you.
It seems weird that we have to do this and then turn this way. Directional.
Take it out.
Yeah, there you go. Well, I'm just the facilitator here tonight, but I want to say briefly before I lob a question at you, that this is my favorite recent collection of short fiction in American letters. And I think this is a fully formed, incredibly talented American literary writer with real vision. And we should all be incredibly happy that stuff like this still happens in American publishing. I am happy that such things still happen. And how rare that you read a first book these days that has theme, vision, absolute confidence, originality, singularity, an idea of what fiction is. All those things are in this book. So if you're just coming here tonight to sample, you've come to the right place. Go to that table after the Q&A and buy one of these because it's a really great book. All right. So I wrote a whole bunch of questions down, but I want to just wing it a little bit.
Oh, good.
So State Forest is such an incredibly strange, beautiful story, and to me, it's right smack in the middle of what you do that I love, which is to say, in terms of style and the way it's canted, initially you sort of think it might be a realistic story, and then somewhere it goes wildly afoul of your expectations. So I want to know a little bit, how does such a story get generated? How soon do you know that it's going to go wildly afoul? What's the process in a story like that?
That story is one of the more recent ones, and they're all the product of the past few years of my life, which have been, as you know, somewhat difficult, and I've had to look at the world a little bit differently. And it's, we used to live, you remember my wife and I got married at Carl Schurz Park. I had a health scare a few years ago, and I've just been playing through my head all these alternative ways I could have gone. Because I've had a lot of lives before this one that also tended to go off in strange directions. I've been alive now through things that I probably should have died from over and over again. And I wanted to create a composite at a certain point where the story starts to break up of all the different possibilities that aren't my life. And I have to tell you, like, I'm so, the stories are pretty dark in this, but you'd never know it if you knew me, because I'm absolutely thrilled to be alive. I'm thrilled to be alive. That story was, also part of the composite was when I married, when we married in Carl Schurz Park, the wedding program, is that what you call it? What do you call it? The thing?
Let's say it's a wedding program.
We'll just say it's the wedding program. It had a poem that's traveled with me my whole, since back in Boston when I was very young, going to undergraduate. I got turned on to this, this poem, this James Schuyler poem called The Elizabethans Call It Dying. And I can't say the title without getting weirdly choked up. It's just this absolutely beautiful poem that I first read when I was living in the Fenway, in the Fens of Boston, you know. Had no idea I would ever live in New York. And it's set around Carl Schurz Park, and it's presumably the narrator and his lover walking through that entire neighborhood where we had our wedding. Just talking to each other, and that's where I think I'd have an Episcopalian service. Big church, doleful bells. I took that straight from Schuyler. So I guess in a weird way it's a love letter to my wife. And at a certain point, those fragments made sense together. You know, it's that idea that sometimes words aren't going to work the right way. So you have to sort of, you know, jury-rig them a bit.
So you're saying the shape of the piece was in the planning stages. You knew it would have this unusual shape from the outset.
Yeah, and then it's full of little, yes. The Ward's Island Bridge is this strange little bridge that just goes, you see the Triborough like right behind it?
We call it the RFK now.
Right, yeah, it's been a while, yes. Right, the RFK. There's just this little spindly thing that goes across the water that just looks crazy, and I guess you can kind of like go up it. And you know, we haven't lived there in so long, and so there's a sort of composite thing. But even like a wild geese that fly with the birds on their wings, the moon on their wings. My daughter, that's her favorite song, and so I threw that in. And there's something about the idea of falling. The actual descent in that story is very, that's realism as far as I'm concerned. There's something to that feels very real, you know. That's a weird one though. I can write a decent social realism story. No? There aren't any?
You have to think about that. But wait, let's just hang on this for a second, just for a second.
I'm glad you're hanging on this, because I never talk about these, you know.
Yeah, so I want to talk, this is a room full of writers, writerly types. I want to talk about the craft issues a little bit.
Yes.
So this is such an unusual piece. What problems are presented in the revision part of a work like this in order to get it to cohere? I mean, it's coming from such an unusual place, and there's the real chance that it could, you know, run off the tracks and be too strange. What happens? How do you shape the material so that it does what it needs to?
You know what it is? It's just revision and like the fifth revision going, that's the stupidest thing I've ever said. And you cut it. And then you keep going. Like, that's okay today, maybe I'll see. And it's this constant additive, reductive process. I had a whole passage in it, for instance, that was traveling back to when I was a kid, this Christmas time when I went down the stairs, and it just didn't work. It didn't feel right. You know, it might be that just musically it wasn't right. There's a great deal of thought put in these. I don't write these things like that, you know. But by the time I get to the final draft of them, I forgot why I was writing them in the beginning. You know, I don't necessarily always remember what prompted it to begin with. That the story of the runner, and a couple of other stories are entirely more recent stories where I've been maybe a little more oblique about things because I'm thinking about things far more, I'm taking life a lot more seriously.
That leads me to another question. Probably many people in the audience don't know that this is a significant time commitment involved in this product, some 15 to 20 years worth of short fiction. So what accounts for that 20 years, and what do you notice differently? How do you assess the recent work versus the work that's older?
The older stuff was all, I didn't have any, you know, I mean, I wasn't even, some of these stories go back farther than that. One of them I wrote when I was 20, 21.
Which is that?
At Night. And it's the one that's far more spare and, I don't know what you call it, but it's not, it doesn't have the lyrical thing that I started really falling in love with later. It's just pure energy, and it's sort of psychotic. It's a very creepy, it's probably the creepiest story in the collection, although I think that may be debatable, I'm not sure. That's one where that was the first story I ever wrote where I broke from trying to write like Raymond Carver. And then it ended up in Bomb. Lish took it, and then the cord refolded, and so I was still left with it, and ended up in Bomb. And so I put it in this collection just because it's had a little bit of a history, but I don't know if it's a story that I would write nowadays. The more recent stuff, The Canyon, the story that you're more than familiar with, is far more, a lot of this is also about the rock band that I used to be in. I was in a rock band. A lot of these stories are about security, The Canyon. All these stories are complete sublimations of being totally freaked out from this other life that I used to be in. And there again, I'm creating a composite, sticking things in and seeing what happens.
Some people may not know what the other life was. Is it fair to ask?
Yeah,
just to be open about the other life a little bit?
Yeah.
So what was the other life?
I was in a band, a rock band that I was in a band for about 6 years and toured the world over and over again. It's gone for 10 months out of the year. The band was called the Lemonheads. They're still kind of together doing stuff, you know. But I got out of that and then went to a writing program, and thank God, because I didn't know what the hell I was going to do. Like, you know, I devoted my entire childhood to learning how to play the drums. I thought I was going to be a drummer. Although by the time I joined the band, even I realized I wasn't going to do that. But you tour like that for so long, and then it stops, and there's just this deafening silence. You know, we'd be on the road for so long that when I came home, my wife, at the time my girlfriend, my wife now, but at the time, I would get home from a tour, and I would sit on the sofa. This is horrible. It's horribly depressing. Sit on the sofa and stare at the floor. And I would just stare, and I wouldn't be able to talk or do anything. I'd just sit there completely freaked out about being in my apartment, where I should be comfortable. And she would go to bed, and she'd get up at 8 in the morning, and I would not have moved the entire time. It was like a form of, like a kind of strange catatonic state that I'd go into initially. And then, you know what, and then like 3 days later, I have to go back on the road and start all over again. So when you stop doing that, and you see the fact that you've stopped as a sort of failure, then you start writing stories that try to reverse engineer all kinds of ways of looking at it differently.
Let's tease out how this material might be sublimated into a story like The Canyon.
Okay.
The Canyon is the first story in the collection. it's mostly about Charles Manson.
Right.
So in what way is it a sublimated?
I'm excited to talk about this because that story is, again, a composite. I'm going to tell you how I wrote it, okay?
Yeah.
20 years ago, I was in LA with these producers, these crazy producers. They had been around, they were Little Richard's band for a while, and they were like some Dick Clark show that wasn't American Bandstand, they were the house band for it. They went on and started their own studio. Should I not talk about this, Kath?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Kath's my friend from back when. They had these amazing stories to tell, these amazing stories. Anecdotes about musicians who might even come in, like at one point Harry Nilsson came in and hung out, and Jeff Skunk Baxter came in. So we were meeting all these crazy people. In the meantime, these producers were telling us stories about their own past. And one was that they had moved into this ranch in Laurel Canyon, and next to them was this crazy pack of, they said they were the dirtiest human beings they'd ever seen in their lives. And it was just these really creepy people who had pretty much overtaken a ranch of the Blind Rancher next door. And these producers had a few run-ins with them. And one of the run-ins was with them trying to take oranges from the grove. And so they then found out a couple months later, after the Sharon Tate, all of that it was the Manson family who had been living next to them and who they had hated and been in these little back and forth battles over. So I've loved that story. I've loved that they didn't know they were living next to the Manson family. But there was no way of writing it because it's just sort of an interesting anecdote. It isn't a story. All right, so there's that. So for 20 years, I was just trying to figure out how can I use this? This is the best story, right? This is so cool, but I can't write it. I don't know how to put myself in it. I don't know how to put anything in it. Then a friend of mine, a poet friend of mine, had been reading, 31 Dreams and 13 Letters, the Richard Hugo collection of poems. And there's one that's called A Letter to Charles Simic. It is Richard Hugo, and it's 31 Letters and 13 Dreams, or vice versa. There's a letter to Charles Simic where he talks about being in a bomber, a B-17, and this poet had met Charles Simic many, many years later at a reading or something, and Charles Simic was like, yeah, I grew up in this town, and the Allies bombed, and Richard Hugo realized that he was the bomber who dropped the bombs on Belgrade when Charles Simic was a little kid. And so this poem is actually a letter to Charles Simic. It's called A Letter to Charles Simic, where he basically says, I'm so glad that I was a terrible bombardier. Like, I was absolutely, I couldn't have bombed anything, you could put it on my forehead. So for some reason, and then the other thing is this sense of, my friend George in Cuba had always told me about this story about a snake in his village that had eaten one of their chickens, and the snake was just completely bloated with this chicken in its neck, and George vividly remembers as a kid his dad coming and cutting the snake open and freeing the chicken just hopped out. It's this awesome surreal image that I thought, what an awesome way to open a story. Well, the idea of freeing something, I used a turkey vulture, the idea of a predator, the idea of going to war and being a World War II hero only to produce a generation that could produce something like the Manson family became this, it just took shape. It just started, the unconscious of it started to piece everything together. The other thing is that sense of alienation was me in a band coming home and looking at everyone going, I'm so confused now. I don't understand anyone around me anymore. So that story managed by just sticking things together. I became the World War II veteran. It totally made sense suddenly. I was really excited about writing that one because that was a pretty ambitious collage.
How are we doing on time? We're all right?
Yeah.
Like 10 more minutes?
10 more minutes and
All right. So where's the novel? Where is the novel?
In page length or in what it's doing?
there must have been a novel stewing all this time,
Yeah,
all these many years.
95,000 words. I've been trying like crazy to get it done, but school started, and so I'm I'm still trying to get it done. It's all done. I have to do some line edits on a couple more passages, and then it'll be ready to go.
And what different problems does the novel present for you from working on the short fiction? Is it just scale? What are the other issues?
You know, I tried with this one to treat it, I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on myself to have an entirely sustained 300-page thing. And so I decided to start writing stories that were all about something that I kept in the back of my mind as I was writing them. And then I created an overarching story that will hopefully hold this all together. The whole idea of linked collections, I went for it, just because I think it's, for me, the easier way of trying to come up with something really long.
When one thinks of a linked collection, to which would you point as being important examples there?
There aren't a lot out there that are that good, I don't think. There's one by this Irish writer, Keith Ridgway, called Hawthorne and Child, and it has some really good work in it. He will be the first to say that his intentions weren't to be entirely successful with it. That was part of the plan. But the few stories in it that really sing, and they operate so tangentially that they let the reader sort of fill in their own ideas, and I appreciated that about it. I don't know, do you know of any good ones that are, I'm trying to think.
I really like Ideas of Heaven by Joan Silver. Did you read that one?
I haven't, no.
She's not here, is she? Doesn't she teach in your program?
She's down the hall.
Yeah, that's a really good book. Or Year of Silence by Madison Smart Bell. Is he here? No, he's not here. That's a good book.
Okay. I've read, I used to really like him. I gotta read some more of him. So that's the novel so far. And you know what's great though is I have 95,000 words. I mean, I tried to write, I'm gonna go back and look at a novel that I had not succeeded in doing. It's a couple hundred pages. I have such a better idea of how you can mess with narrative motion thanks to teaching. I mean, I've learned so much about my own process from teaching. I'm going to go back and practice a little of what I preach, I think.
You're a relatively new teacher, right? Is it like 2 or 3 years you've been at Sarah?
4 semesters, 2 or 3 semesters maybe.
How's that changed the writing practice for you, being in the front of the room?
You know, it's a lot harder to get a lot of work done, but because I have so little time, I'm actually really diligent. Because I don't have a lot of time, and I have a 3.5-year-old, I have this incentive to like outlive myself a little bit. You know what I mean? Like I want her to be proud of me in 40 years or something like that. And so like between that and the fact that I don't have a lot of time, the amount of work I'm getting done in that brief period in the morning is pretty amazing. I'm pretty excited about it.
And does fathering have an emotional impact on the work for you? Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
Of what kind?
I don't think there's anything I write now that doesn't feel far more whole. You know, when I wrote this story called At Night, it was very Lish. I didn't know anything about Lish at the time. It turns out I can see why he wanted it, because it looked like something, I can see why, you know. There's no heart in it whatsoever. And I'm a fan of Gordon Lish. I'm not suggesting that that's a problem. But that particular story is not representative of anything I'm trying to do now. I'm thinking a lot more about harmony rather than energy. And I think that my daughter's done that. I didn't know I could be this happy. You know, I had no idea. And that's 3.5 years old, is that happiness.
Do you think that the sort of thematic darkness of some of the stories is expiation for you? Because I would agree, knowing you, that the darkness is out of cast with the extreme upbeat, good guy, David Ryan thing. So is the darkness being an act of sort of expiation of that material for you?
You know what I'm wondering is, I'm not, I don't mind getting really close to stuff that's, that I'm unfamiliar with. I've never had a problem like stepping into something that's foreign and scary. And I think when I was a baby, I used to have these, what do they call them, febrile seizures? I'd have these seizures all the time. And and then, you know, when you're in a band, you seek out other versions of obtaining that state of grace. I think I've never had a problem getting close to things that I don't even understand about myself. And I have to say that first story that became a real story instead of a story was where I came close to things that I couldn't even recognize in myself. And because that kind of worked, I kept going with it.
The last story has a sort of coiled violence thing to security with guys throwing the beer cans on the lawn and then coming up to the security guys and sort of threatening them. And it feels to me, having read your work for a long time, that there is this kind of coiled violence in the back of the work a little bit.
Yeah.
I feel like it has literary antecedents in addition to maybe having some psychic antecedents. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah. Well, John Hawkes, clearly. And I think through John Hawkes, I have also learned a little bit about how to touch the unconscious a little closer than I would have ever learned from all sorts of other really great writers. There's just so many people who have done that, you know, and those are Poe. As a kid, I loved Poe. You know, it's hard not to read that. And I used to read Poe till 5 in the morning. My mom promised me a new drum set if I got A's in school. So I got A's in school, but because I had never been a particularly good student, I had to learn how to learn. And so I self-taught, learned how to learn, and I would make myself, like, if I had a biology chapter to learn, I would handwrite the entire chapter. And then read it over again and then write it again. Because I wanted this drum set. I wanted it desperately, and I just didn't know how to do things. But then I started getting used to making coffee at like midnight. And I'm like 13 years old, you know. And I remember one night staying up so late, I was reading Poe, that I drifted into some state where Poe explained God to me. And it was insane. He explained the Trinity, and I'm like, I know the Trinity now. I understand the Trinity. I can't believe this. And the next morning, I tried to find that story. And I have a volume of Poe, and last week I tried to find the Trinity story. I'm not making that up. I tried to find the story. It just slipped out of my, you know.
That sounds like a Borges story to me.
That's a little Borges.
Yeah, you could write that one. What about Conrad? Because I always think Conrad is the big sort of sublimated influence.
Right. Conrad, he makes me crazy, but I learned crazy things from him. I mean, I think he changed everything. I think Dickens set up a lot of really interesting things in motion, and then Conrad just came and made everything crazy. And yeah, I think it was while I was at school at Bennington, I might have gone on a total Conrad binge. I mean, he's just so strange. And his syntax, you know, he writes these little clauses, and sort of, they're like little hooks. They just keep going, and sometimes they sort of drift off in these ways that feel so awkward and uncomfortable, and then they come back and they sound consonant and sort of harmonious. And, you know, that story about him, he used to write, and his wife would sort of very carefully like set down the lunch, you know, it was like a yada or something. She'd set down the tray of lunch and then run, because she could hear him in his bedroom, sitting in his bed like, you know, with his characters. And then he'd finish a book and he'd send it off, and she'd still hear him in his room, like he would continue the conversation. And that to me is a Conradian reading experience. There's just something so crazy about it, and it's so tied up in something bound up inside of him. So yeah.
And the formal structures are sort of explications of that psychic engagement.
And that's the thing. You know, that's the thing I feel like with form. If you can figure figure yourself out well enough, and if you can read enough stuff of different writers doing radically different, read Kanzu and read Melville, you know what I mean? Like, go all over the place. You're going to start to figure out how to just write whatever you want and make it work. You know, that story, State Forest, that was a very deliberate attempt to just sort of assert a form on what I wanted to do, you know? I couldn't have done that back when I was writing that story at night. I would have never understood how to do that. But you can apply form, you can use all kinds of formal conceits that people don't normally think to use, or you can let the ideas themselves generate the form. And that's actually where the stories nowadays for me are going, is the idea itself will create the shape.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. That's how I feel about it.
That's what you do.
All right, you guys anyone want to ask a question? Always the first one's the hardest to pry loose. We can skip to the second one. Go
Yes.
ahead.
I noticed that Amy Hempel wrote about your stories.
Yes, she did.
And I find that very interesting because a certain similarity that I find, a certain sympathetic harmony, let's call it, between her style and yours is leaving so much unsaid.
Right.
And so I went to a reading of hers and I asked her, you know, how do you decide what to leave out, you know, when the whole is not so large that somebody will actually not be able to they'll make the leap and they'll fall short, you know,
Right.
They won't make it to the other side.
Right.
And so she talked a little bit about how she goes about that. And before, when you were saying the process of revision, like taking out and, you know, a process of sort of, how do you go about it? Like, you know, not making the leap so large that people won't be able to.
Yeah, it's like that metaphor of the spark plug. You gap your plugs. If the gap's too great, you won't get a spark. And the idea is to get it to where there's a spark and where it fires with a certain consistency.
Right.
Sparking the gap, as some of my students are about to learn, like in crazy ways, that's all I think about, is how to get just enough distance between two ideas and yet maintain a certain consonance between them. One thing, for instance, if you're really intentional about ambiguity, if you use vivid, concrete, all those typical workshop things, vivid, concrete detail, and you point it toward ambiguity, you actually start to create a form of harmony out of the text. And that's something Amy Hempel does, I think, without maybe putting it in so many words. And anytime you very skillfully shoot for ambiguity, where the space takes on its own meaning, let's say between the two ideas that you are putting down concretely, that spark is going to be the reader interaction. And if you know, Chekhov, for instance, might say something and it can be taken several different ways. Well, you've just created 3 or 4 meanings that will then continue throughout the story. And this goes to actually State Forest and some of those stories. The idea is to plant the different sounds so that they all work together, so that in fact you don't have a single State Forest, Susquehannock, Hogsback, you know. Those are just contributing to several other things that are so tangentially related, but when you put them together they create a sound, they create something. And I think that's definitely something that Amy Hempel probably does. I know the other thing that I learned today, somebody told me about this, that she had mentioned animals. She likes to write about animals because they can represent a sort of purity, a state that can't be expressed in human terms. And I'm like, did I hear her say that? Because I've been saying that a lot lately. I think I stole that from Amy Hempel. But we definitely share that sense of what can't be said, what you simply can't put straightforward. I like writing stories that are straightforward and they get to sort of an interesting thing that this happens and this happens and this happens. But every once in a while I have to do something different. And the shorter stories tend to be the crazier ones. It's easier to work with that space, and she works with small units usually.
Well, I just found it interesting that when you were talking about your novel as well, that because it's in stories, the same thing is happening over a larger, of sort of things that point at each other, kind of, without actually necessarily.
You know, the novel's going to be really crazy. It's very verbose. Like there's a whole chapter where I try to imagine what if No, I shouldn't. You know, there's this writer, Thomas Bernhard, and his characters always have the same sort of voice. It's always a Bernhardian sort of tone. And I was like, what if all Austrians talked like Thomas Bernhard? So I create a little chalet in the Swiss Alps, or in the Austrian Alps, and everyone just talks in this barking tone at each other. So it's a little different from this collection.
Other questions?
Yeah.
I had spoken to Daniel Woodrow in this room maybe a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, about the music in his work. And he seemed to go along the lines of being a melodist and a tunesmith and a rhythm guy. And you're talking an awful lot about harmony here.
Yeah.
And his stuff, which is of course more crime fiction proper, you know, which is a really good book, by the way, that the Outlaw album, I think it's called, from a couple of years ago.
Uh-huh.
And yours, I can hear that same thing driving the shorter pieces which you read tonight.
Yeah.
I wonder if do you try to access that because you're a musician, or does it find you because you're a musician?
It comes from a very strange place. Will this be too long for me to talk about? It's sort of a crazy...
I'm just going to check our time constraint, but you have to talk about this. It's important.
Okay. When I was a little kid, well, a couple of things. I spontaneously told this story at a craft lecture I was giving at school a few semesters ago, where I had forgotten about it, and suddenly I'm standing at this podium with all these people, and I'm like, oh, you know, actually there was this time when I was first learning the drums, I was really into African drumming. Because it seemed to me, if you knew how to play African drumming, you could hypnotize people. And so I thought, I'm going to learn African drumming because the polyrhythms, you can see, they'll make people dance for 3 days and everything else. Whatever, anyway. But I was really interested in how music theory worked. So even at a very young age, I went off and taught myself classical composition and harmony. I got this book, Walter Piston's book, Harmony. Right, the standard, you know.
Yeah.
And I, with my homemade version of how to get A's in school, I typed the entire thing and hand drew all the staff paper and all the notes. So I learned music theory that way. And then I started doing this Berklee College of Music. I was a kid, I was a silly kid, but a correspondence course on jazz harmony. So you start learning how to write big band scores. Now, I played the drums. I knew the piano, not enough to play a song on it, but I knew the way the keys worked together. I knew the harmonic motion. And I ended up learning enough to be able to compose whole scores without a piano, just out of my head, which is not uncommon. I wasn't like some gifted kid. That's what you start learning how to do after a certain stage, right? And then I left home and came to Boston and became like a rock drummer. And that was fine, and I lost all that. I left it all away. And so now when I write, I definitely think about all that stuff. It all gets applied to this. It all goes back to that. So all the music theory comes into these stories, especially the short ones, where there are...
Right.
Yeah.
I kind of saw that when you read it.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Being one of those guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to kind of riff on what he was saying, because especially in the first story, I immediately picked up, I could hear music
Yeah.
in the writing, and it wasn't just rhythms, you know, but it felt like there was some kind of composition happening.
Right.
And that in connection to the strong visuals, and also just with the drawings that I've seen that have come to us through the handouts, I was realizing how this is, I don't know, how does these other artistic abilities help to inform the actual process of writing? And how can, like for example, if a person has many different talents, but writing seems to be the current main tack, how can we get other forms of creative talent to work for the writing rather than being treated as a separate entity to where you're at that point where like, oh, gotta choose one or the other. And it's like, no, how can I make this work as a multimedia thing, even if it is words on page?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer. I mean, you know what it is though. The thing that's great about music and writing is that they're both sort of temporal. They're both time-based. I mean, arguably they're time-based. You could operate spatially in either realm, and Morton Feldman is awfully spatially oriented as a composer. And there's, like, for instance, the Lit Mag Cake Train is full of spatially oriented, gorgeous writing that isn't. It is theoretically, narrative is always time-based. You have a timeline. The story takes a while. And so for me to combine music into the writing is easier than I think other ideas. But you can pull ideas from anything, you know. But I don't know. I mean, that's a hard one. It depends on what you're interested in too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're in a really happy place now, married and your daughter, but you still have these really dark stories. So I was wondering if you have kind of tricks or ways that you can prevent yourself from kind of sinking into really dark places in the rest of your life, like when you're working on these dark pieces?
That's interesting. You know,
I want to know the answer to this one.
Well, I don't really drink much anymore. That was a big help, stopping that. I don't know, you know, I was trouble. I was arrested for grand larceny at age 13. I have a past. I have done all sorts of crazy things, and I had to, in fact, some of the stories go into those sorts of things. I was a nice kid. I wasn't like a bad kid, but I had a lot of energy, and music sort of spared me from music. That story, Security, is actually about a guy. I got into trouble and owed my parents $10,000 to keep me out of a detention center for the rest of my young adult life. And so what you have to do when you're only 13 is you can't get a decent job, obviously, and so you get a job, and especially if you're in South Chicago, it's $1.50 an hour, you know. So I was getting these $1.50 an hour jobs to pay back the $10,000 for the grand larceny, and on adult charges it would have been grand larceny, but they didn't have a child version. You hit pay dirt, you know. We don't have a kid version of that charge, so we're just going to call it an adult thing. I guess I'm just drawn to those dark things. I think the rest of my life. I also think there's a great. Was it William Carlos Williams who just said there's a great beauty to sadness. I mean, there's something about it that's an entirely useful thing to have as a part of your life. I seem for material to go to the darker moments. One of the jobs that I had was this guy would pick us up in a van, and he would drive us around to the worst neighborhoods in South Chicago, and a little souther of it, so they weren't as bad as some of the really bad South Chicago neighborhoods. And he'd let us loose, and we'd have to go drop flyers off in all the apartments and all these projects, basically. But he was interesting. He had been a hockey player, and he was going to the Olympics, and he got sticked, and he lost an eye. And he was driving a van full of 13-year-olds and dropping them off and letting them deliver flyers for a living. And that stuck with me from when I was 13, and that became the character in the story Security, which is the last story in this collection. And I transposed my own sense of failure leaving the band into him. I merged myself into him. So I play with this stuff all the time. It's helped me, actually. I think it's let me, they say you live, 70% of your life in the limbic, and the 30% that you process things up front, great. But most of your day you're spending in this crazy state. I think I'm just trying to filter memories from various times in my life of the crazy state through it. Also making up sad things isn't as great as repurposing sad things. I think when you take something that has hurt you or nagged at you for your whole life, and you write it and you fix it, or you put it on to someone else, or you put art around it, if you can make it beautiful. Like all my stories, all I want to do is, it's like Henry Green was asked, why do you write? And like that, he was like, to make something beautiful. And I feel that so entirely. I mean, as dark as the stories are, what I'm after is beauty. And I'm not answering your question at all. I'm sorry about that. Yes.
In talking about the music and the harmonic whole of the
Mhm.
stories, and I've read the book. So I'll finish a story and I'll feel that wholeness. And then all these little pieces start like scattershot at me. So like in the story, I don't know the titles, but the story about the old guy who lives on the cliff that
Yeah.
falls out. So questions like, is he dealing with the detritus of the world, and the two dogs, are they feral or are they noble? And there's more urine in that story than I've seen.
A lot of urine in that story, right?
And the other one, maybe Citrine, I don't know, the two guys who are in the car watching the house, and each of them is so interesting. And what happens when the people come in and find the voodoo doll and the mailbox? So that I've had this wonderful short time where everything is wonderful. And then I'm sitting there going, okay. I mean, do you know that you've left people with that?
That's the goal.
Oh, good.
That means they're working.
Yeah.
They're supposed to work. They're supposed to linger long after you read them. They're not about they're not entirely about. I'm glad you say that, Linda. That's very nice of you. Linda's a neighbor of mine. She's a wonderful, wonderful person. That's the goal. That's why you do these things. I think is to have something lasting that keeps sort of
Yeah.
going. Yeah, yeah.